Welcome to the fourth Utzon series lecture. My name is Alex Arness. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Built Environment. It's a cold night and it's a full house. In fact, some might say a fuller than normal house. And that's testimony to our lecture series and to Rob Freestone tonight. Thank you for coming on this cold night. We welcome a number of very distinguished guests. We have one member of our Advisory Council, Penelope Seidler, who's joined us. We also have Jonathan Barnett, who many of you would know as one of the leaders in urban design, really changing the way we think about urban design, who's joined us. He's on holiday. This is a good holiday to have, coming to our faculty. And of course, that leads me to saying a little bit about our faculty for those who don't know. We do have a comprehensive approach to understanding the city, the elements of the city, and we have all the disciplines which, if you like, plan, design, construct and manage cities. And that's an appropriate introduction for tonight's lecture on building an urban nation, the planning history of this nation. Rob has developed this lecture from originally a commission from the Australian government, which led to a book which has led to this lecture. And of course, many of you would know Rob, forefront in research in this faculty and in this space in the world, and also, of course, a faculty member since 1991 and a professor since 2000, if I've got that right. So I need not say much more about this important night for us. It's great that you came here. I hope you can enjoy the lecture experience. We welcome you to all of the series. We have some very interesting ones coming up, which you can see in the program that we're already putting in place next year's lecture series. So I welcome Rob Freestone.
Thank you, Alec, for the introduction, and thank you for coming along tonight on a pretty ordinary evening, or at least hanging around for a longer day here at the university. This is a presentation that advocates that more attention be paid to the positive legacy of urban planning in Australia. Urban heritage is managed primarily by planners. But paradoxically, one of the areas not well covered by heritage is planning itself. And the talk, as Alec alludes to, draws from research undertaken for the Australian government in a study with the City Futures Research Centre. And that was a collaborative, indeed cross-disciplinary and cross-institutional project. But at the outset, I need to say that there was work done by my colleagues Simon Pinniger and Ray Bunker. And so when I talk later about what we did, it's not the royal we I'm using. Part of that study has now appeared in a book. And the title of that book gives us the presentation tonight as well. And this is the first opportunity I've had in Australia, at least, to talk about this work in a public forum. So I'm grateful for that opportunity. There are various sites of planning significance around the world recognised as having heritage value. They're mostly iconic showpieces like central Paris and, of course, here Washington DC. What animated my interest in the study was the notion of a wider, more systemic, maybe less spectacular, but equally distinctive heritage of planning, and specifically planned environments. And while I'm not bringing a radical critique to the whole construction of what urban heritage means, I think this approach does inject a new perspective in how we might view the nature of cultural landscapes. I convinced myself that this was something truly original and something truly novel until I discovered, after the book was published, before this lecture unrolled, an article entitled "The Heritage of Planned Communities," which is somewhat stealing my thunder, and more to the point, this paper was actually published in 1941. Although written for an American audience, I'll paraphrase the essential argument because it's close to what I'm on about. In the study of architectural history, Carl Feiss, who was an American planner who worked with Raymond Unwin, what he says is that in the study of architectural history there is an unfortunate gap which should be closed as promptly as possible. This gap lies in the neglect of those architectural groups and planned communities which form so basic a part of our heritage. Unfortunately, architectural history has too often been studied solely as individual and isolated buildings, rather than by emphasising the interrelationships of buildings in groups and ensembles. Well, precisely is the emphasis I add there, and from an Australian perspective, that's what this Utzon lecture is all about. And I'm going to speak primarily to the expansiveness of the territory covered in the book Urban Nation. I'll divide my talk this evening into four main areas. The context of and for the study, the methodology, the findings and the implications and the issues arising. That is, in that last part, thinking more generally about the identification of threats to and respect for the planned environment. I want to start with putting this research into a broader setting. It turns out to be a fairly traditional one. The standard methodology used to identify heritage, and this is well nigh universal, is the list in capital letters. Lists of places considered of significance to the community, be that the neighbourhood or the nation, are generated and kept by lots of different bodies, public and private. The lists that matter, perhaps the most, are those that are kept by government, local, state, federal, since these are the lists which ultimately convey society's self-definition of what places it wants to keep and how it might do that through a regulatory environment. If a place is on one of these government lists, then a variety of protection mechanisms are set to trigger. Demolition, for example, becomes a little bit more difficult, although not impossible. These lists are not inviolate, and indeed in the wake of the Productivity Commission report of 2006 on the conservation of heritage places, which is essentially a neoliberal critique, they are not as valued as they once were. The Register of the National Estate, which emanates out of this classic report from the early 1970s, for example, is no longer actively maintained. But lists survive, and they're demanded as a product of historical research, society's duty of care, and by a capitalist property market that wants to seek certainty in development controls. The first lists were drafted at the end of the Second World War, when the National Trust was established here in Sydney in 1947. One of the things it went about doing straight away was making a list of historic buildings. That was quite small. It was confined generally to major public buildings or homes of the elite, like Alexander Macleay here at Elizabeth Bay House. Also the first property actually acquired by the state after World War II as a means of preservation. But from this beginning, heritage has come to mean more than just architecture, more than just physical artefacts, more than just the purview of the elite, and a community obligation as much as a government one. From the 1970s, when heritage legislation takes off at state and national level, the lists begin to grow. And for the built environment, architecture plays a central role. And a major catalyst for this work was that of Robin Boyd in Australia's Home in 1952, who identified a series of housing typologies, which over time have become the basis for identifying, in particular, residential heritage. And in time, these typologies have become much more sophisticated and complex. But in turn, also a wider spectrum of architectural artefacts, historical, environmental, culturally significant places has come to be recognised. This is the Productivity Commission's estimate showing how many places might have some form of statutory control in Australia. We've got a hierarchical system if you just focus on the row marked totals. So you've got a small number of sort of national or world heritage sites. It's grown a bit since then. Moving down to a much larger number of items protected in local environmental planning schemes and their equivalent, something in the order of 150,000. Well, that's quite a significant stock. So much so that the point of this report by the Productivity Commission was to try and sort of loosen that up a little for the implications it would have for the public purse and private owners. Unfortunately, I'm going to go a little against the grain tonight because my point is that there are some other important spaces and places created by urban planning that deserve to be recognised too, and which perhaps aren't at the moment. Well, that 150,000 odd sites covers an enormous variety. Heritage has come to mean natural heritage, indigenous heritage, symbolic, spiritual heritage, as well as human settlement, the built environment, which is my main focus tonight. Opera House, as you see, are the last one on that list by David Yenkin. And Utzon's Opera House is indeed an icon, added to the UNESCO World Heritage List in 2007 alongside the Taj Mahal and the Great Wall of China as a masterpiece of human creativity. And the actual site boundary for this building does recognise the broader curtilage and setting in which it sits. Well, there are many other venerable examples of architecture inscribed on heritage lists. But what about planning? What has it produced? Well, given the bad, oftentimes odious press that planning seems to attract, critics will scoff. And maybe cynics would nominate a streetscape like this as typical of planning's legacy to the environment, or maybe like that. However, I had in mind something that was a little bit more fully resolved. Here is a place that is undeniably recognised for its planning qualities, and I will come back to those a little bit later on. It's the recognition of places like this, and indeed unlike this, but still deriving from planning interventions, which is what I'm on about this evening. One of the trends of the last decade has been a greater number of thematic heritage studies, looking at all different sorts of sites and themes. You know, motels, substations, post offices, places associated with federation, migrant landscapes, you name it. The Commonwealth Government has moved with that trend, and they've commissioned studies on convict sites, on transportation sites, on maritime history. And so, in line with that trend, and out of the blue, this study popped up a couple of years ago to look at urban and town planning places, which, with a team, I was successful in getting to work on. I don't want to drag you into all the technical details here, but there are some goals, some assumptions, some definitions that I need to outline here at the beginning because they raise issues for how we went about our task and what it is we're really trying to get at. The fundamental caveat at the beginning, following the brief, was that the focus was on national heritage. That is the sort of number one outstanding places in the Commonwealth. Places of exceptional significance, carrying with them management implications under Commonwealth legislation. In assessing the claims for sites to be on that list, there is a list of 9 formal criteria. This is basically an elaboration of conventional considerations significance for sites in Australian history, whether they're associated with particular individuals, how they're valued by a particular community, are they unique, are they rare in some way. And you only have to tick one of these criteria satisfactorily to get on the heritage list. And on that National Heritage List today, there are over 100 different sites. It's dominated by natural sites, like the Great Barrier Reef and Uluru, Blue Mountains. But there's also a bunch of cultural sites as well, including Utzon's Opera House. It is, in terms of built heritage, largely a list of things. What tends to be missing, from my point of view, is a wider sense of space and planning. For example, Canberra has several national heritage items listed here, but what is not recognised is the overall town plan in which they are cited. That is, the broader spatial framework and its historic foundations and essential qualities not accorded direct recognition. So it's that bigger picture, recognising plans, not just artefacts, spaces, not just buildings, whole communities, not just things in them, which is what I'm on about tonight. Planning, though, is not an unproblematical activity. The profession itself wrestles with how do you define planning and what it's all about. And these issues impacted on us in how we were going to go about this study. What is a planned landscape? Well, here the challenge was to try and distinguish planning from design. Design would have us venturing into, I think, a much wider territory of landscape design, forestry, irrigation, land reclamation, nurseries, arboretums and so on, and in turn into a whole other cast of characters which might take us away from our main focus. How to measure excellence. There are different and shifting notions in the professions, in the wider community, as to what is good planning. We had to deal with that. How to measure planning disasters. That is, what do we do about those horrible, dysfunctional, social and aesthetic nightmares that might have seemed like a good idea at the time? A bit like brutalist architecture, you know, no one particularly loves it, but it perhaps deserves some recognition. Well, we played a kind of a straight bat with this one. We went to those National Heritage List criteria, and if something got up on that, then that tended to mean that antisocial, dysfunctional places tended to be ruled out. Incidentally, the famous planning historian Peter Hall once wrote a book entitled Great Planning Disasters, which featured the Sydney Opera House. And that kind of turned out all right, didn't it? What of other stakeholders? Well, planners, sort of humble professionals, unlike architects, recognise a variety of different inputs into the planning and design process. And so we had to think about where the distinctive contribution of planning actually lay. And it tended to be back at the beginning when the foundations, the groundwork was being laid. And what about social conflict? Planning is essentially a political process. A lot of the best planning outcomes come from the bottom up, not just from the top down. And so there was recognition that we needed to deal with that as well. And so what is planning? How do you do a study of planning heritage if you're not quite sure what planning actually is? Well, recognising that sort of definitional debate that we went through are the possible covers for the book. And sort of in a microcosm, they represent the essence of the internal debate we had as a team. Is planning the kind of archetypal planned set piece up the top, or is it the outcome of struggle and community voices down below? It's probably both, of course. It's really a mosaic of outcomes which this cover tries to capture. But eventually we had to say something, and this was our definition. It's a definition that squeezes out quite a lot. It squeezes out transport planning specifically, squeezes out social planning and other specialties. They await their own studies. So the planning I'm talking about this evening is essentially a physical planning or a spatial planning that recognises sites that are the outcome of long-term, purpose-driven physical plans. And there's a diversity of places around that can be classified in those terms. So we had to sort out ways in which we could categorise all of these places around the country that might have some claims to significance. And so we worked on a series of six themes. Founding the capital cities. These were the places that represented the initial templates for the capital cities. These were the places that were planned to advance the spread of rural settlement and to exploit specific resources. These were the places that were associated with plans for guiding and managing metropolitan development. The fourth theme recognised those places which exemplified the role of planning in greenfield development. There are also places that were created through the planned redevelopment of cities. And finally, there were civic and open spaces, also fashioned by planning. So these, in fact, became the chapters of the book. They've now sort of moved into becoming sort of lectures I give to my second year class on history and heritage, and I'm glad to see so many of my students here this evening. I won't go on about this, but this is kind of a 7-point summary of how we went about the research. We did a lot of literature review. We checked what state and national authorities had recognised as of planning significance in heritage registers, and there weren't many things at all. We did an online survey, a questionnaire, where we invited anyone of interest to nominate sites of interest. And gradually, you know, we built up a couple of hundred places and then had to whittle them down into places to really look at. Because remember, we were looking for those sites that were considered of national significance, that is, at the peak of interest. And that sort of shows the sequence where we came up with about 23 different places. And so in the third part of my talk this evening, I want to whiz you through, as our former Prime Minister might say, I want to whiz you through these 23 different places. This is the list. Even after all the checks and balances that were built into this process, it remains a little subjective, to be honest. And I've got to confess, I'm concerned that this is being taped, but there was a slight bit of fudging going on here. We wanted to make sure that every state and territory was represented, because we didn't want howls of protest if the Northern Territory, for example, didn't get up here. And we were told that a recent Perth-based member of the Australian Heritage Council would have been extremely peeved if there were no WA examples. So to some extent we had to accommodate the politics of geography, but all of these places I felt deserved to be up here. I want to go through them not state by state, territory, but chronologically, with one or two images flashed up for each of them. The oldest site, a precinct, is the core of Governor Macquarie's Sydney. As Sydney transformed itself from an unruly penal colony to a sort of a modest Georgian outpost of the British Empire, there was a planning ethos helping that process, helping to define critical civic spaces and buildings and the relationship between them. So the Mint, Hyde Park and its barracks, St James's Church opposite what is now the Conservatorium, all of these add up to an important cultural ensemble in many different ways, but they also represent, I think, a purposeful and really the first European attempt to implant a civic improvement ethos on the continent. And the celebration of Macquarie's bicentennial legacy and what that means socially and politically, of course, has been a major cultural event in Sydney this year. Plan of Melbourne, 1830s, the grid laid down by Robert Hoddle, devoid of the public spaces that expressed higher civic ideals at the time, but nonetheless forming this spatial matrix that has memorably shaped an evolving urban landscape ever since. So we get Sydney and Melbourne together to sort of keep both cities happy. We also keep Adelaide happy, the plan from the 1830s. A far more ambitious template with a residential town to the north, a commercial town to the south, a river with parkland in between, grand public squares and an encircling parkland to prevent sprawl. Really the high point of the sort of colonial town planning approach. Bathurst, Central West New South Wales, selected as representative of those towns that were rolled out in Eastern Australia from the 1820s onwards under the town planning regulations promulgated by Governor Ralph Darling. Here's the genesis of the classic Australian country town with its wide streets and generous square blocks. And we have a Darling settlement up close, by the way, to UNSW, and it's called Coogee. New Norcia in WA, north of Perth, established in 1847 as an Aboriginal mission by Spanish Benedictine monks. And one of them, Dom Salvado, used the principles of ancient monastic planning to plan this new mission in the New World. And so the conception then and the feel now of New Norcia, which remains a monastic retreat, is really quite different from the typical Aussie town done elsewhere at that time. Harndorf in the Adelaide Hills might have looked, might still look like a typical country town, but it was very different. It was settled by German immigrants in the 1840s. In the original Harndorf plan was a combination of two traditional German systems of agricultural settlement, characterised overall by deep allotments and continuous frontage to the street. A very distinctive urban form and one that is still there today. Let me jump to the later 19th century and introduce another of our potential national heritage sites, which is St Vincent Place in South Melbourne. An exceptional product of Victorian era planning of square and terrace precincts. And quickly jumping to the early 20th century in the planned suburb era. Appian Way at Burwood, a unique leasehold precinct of outsized Federation homes. Just down the road, Daceyville, a pioneering social housing project from just before World War I. Extraordinarily, the parks at the tip of Daceyville were conceived as akin to the Piazza del Popolo in Rome, with a sort of trident of radiating streets, but it hasn't quite worked in practice, I have to confess. Lutana on the Derwent River in Hobart, a cameo arts and crafts styled model industrial village designed by Melbourne architect Walter Butler. Colonel Light Gardens in Adelaide, designed by Charles Reed in the early 1920s, the most convincing adaptation of British garden city principles, and embodying many of those elements, usable green space, healthy walkability, that we still value today. So too Castle Crag, Walter Burley Griffin's waterside model suburb with its distinctive curvilinear plan, inspired at least in part by the work of Frederick Law Olmsted in the United States. Garden City, no less, in Melbourne, another 1920s social housing project by the State Savings Bank, modelled directly on interwar British social housing with its distinctive two-storey semi-detached building form, and a handsome, intact, but of course gentrified estate even to today. I'm about halfway through this sequence. This is Johnston Park in Geelong, a notable attempt from the 1910s to craft an American-inspired civic centre in a landscape setting and make it the symbolic heart and gateway to a regional city. Something that's substantially come true, complete with handsome bandstand donated by the Mayor and the obligatory neoclassical buildings, an art gallery and a war memorial. Brisbane's Anzac Square, by 1920s Commonwealth architect John Smith Murdoch, looking a little bit cluttered in this image and a bit hemmed in, but the essential core of a park, war memorial in the foreground, flanking stripped classical office buildings, an axial vista down to a 19th century post office. All of these a nice ensemble in the City Beautiful idiom. An interwar scheme by Perth planners Carl Clem and Percy Hope for the extension of suburban Perth. This involves a coastal satellite town there to the left, a new planned suburb to the right, linked by green parkways across a green belt. You know, it's a textbook representation of mid-20th century planning theory, and was substantially coming true by the 1950s. The RAF base in Darwin, the one site from the Northern Territory, developed under the supervision of the architect Benny Burnett in the early 1940s. This integrated institutional and housing buildings within a broader geometric plan. One commentator at the time said nothing else of town planning quality existed in Australia at that time. Remote Woomera, notorious for its refugee camp under the previous federal government and better known for its ongoing role in defence and space research, but of note here this evening as perhaps the first planned community, maybe the first planned new town in post-World War II Australia, showcasing all of those ideas that went to make up the neighbourhood planning ideal that remains influential to the present day, with residential streets calmed for through traffic, a central civic and commercial precinct, Radburn-style walkways and surrounding green belt, although the green belts here are a little bit browner given the location. But even a visit today to Woomera, it's like a slice of 1950s Canberra in the bush. Elizabeth, the first truly planned metropolitan new town in Australia by the South Australian Housing Trust, perhaps a more wasteful use of space than we might contemplate today, but unmistakably a planned environment of its era. Kwinana, another one of these post-World War II new towns, an industrial port town to serve a expanding workforce under a state development strategy in Coburn Sound. rare product for the era of a female town planner, Margaret Fielman, who later became one of the foundation members of the Australian Heritage Commission. So I'm nearly done in this sequence. The green rectangle, the green circle, somewhat paradoxically mark the footprint of Australia Square. Lend-Lease developed, Harry Seidler designed, and it's great that his widow is here with us tonight. This led the way in CBD integrated urban renewal, even if few of the projects that followed were half as good. In the foreground, the new community of Thurgoona in New South Wales, planned in the Albury-Wodonga Growth Centre in the 1970s. And this has been chosen to represent that legacy of the urban policy initiatives of the Whitlam era, and also capture how that spilled into regional Australia. And my last site is Canberra. And our most radical and admittedly not very practical conclusion was to recognise all of metropolitan Canberra, starting with the footprint of the entire urban region, which is quite unlike any other Australian capital city, and reflects the influences that go back about good urban form to Ebenezer Howard and the Garden City movement, back to Clarence Stein and the regional city theories of the 1920s, with integrated network of new towns framed by open space and linked by what Clarence Stein called townless highways. And it's a place where planning values are embedded in so many aspects of its urban form. Early garden suburb neighbourhoods, the parkways, master planned infill, and of course the central parliamentary area as well. Here's a city which is a virtual open-air museum of modern city planning, for good and bad, and I'll come back to it shortly. So this was a list of 23 places that we thought in different ways, but in excellent ways, captured the evolution and expression of planning in European Australia over the last 200 plus years. So our report was duly handed to the Department of the Environment, who said thanks very much, smiled, and then went their merry way. What has happened? And this brings me to the last part of my talk this evening. What happened to our recommendations, and quickly moving on, because not much, and quickly moving on to consider what were some of the issues that arise out of this talk this evening. Well, the problem with virtually all the places that we thought were interesting is that they're all rather densely settled. And there is a clear reluctance, it has emerged on the part of the Commonwealth Government to get involved in heritage declarations over sites that have lots of complex private property fragmentation. So revealingly, just one of the sites that we mentioned in our study as possibly worthy of National Heritage listing has got up. What is it? It's the plan of Central Adelaide. The key elements of that 1837 plan by William Light remain substantially intact. The two major city areas, the Torrens River, the 6 town squares, and of course the iconic parkland. This designation, however, effectively excises all private property. It covers only the undeveloped open space and the road system. That's probably a realistic compromise, but it does, I think, offer a significant gesture to the public realm. So that was a good tick. Encouragingly also, in the just released finalised priority assessment list for the National Heritage List put out by the Department of Environment for 2010-2011, Colonial Sydney appears as a place to be assessed. This is a 100-hectare site which comprises the key elements of Macquarie Sydney, the Mint and Hyde Park Barracks and the Domain, Botanical Gardens that you can see in this slide, but also extending to College Street to the south, the Conservatorium to the north and Macquarie Place to the west. There's more, of course, to this site than town planning, but this was one of the places that we felt deserved consideration, so I'd be interested to see if it does get up. It takes a bit to get a site up to the National Heritage List. And decisions are ultimately made at the highest political level. I think it's one of the few powers still retained by Minister Garrett in the current government. And the process of evaluation can take up to 2 years. Colonel Light Gardens was nominated for the National Heritage List, but was unsuccessful, which was a disappointing outcome. But I think the big problem for Colonel Light Gardens was the fragmented property ownership. That was neatly avoided in central Adelaide, much more difficult to do when you've got complex residential streetscapes to try and conserve. But let me widen this out a little now in my sort of closing remarks. Because the issue of planning heritage is not just about national government. It affects all levels of government and indeed all communities. State, territory, local guidelines can be just, if not more effective, in conserving the heritage values of planned places. Colonel Light Gardens, for example, might not have made it to the national level, but it's in good shape because it happens to be a state heritage area. There's a conservation management plan attached to it which contains quite detailed guidelines for respecting the integrity of that place as it evolves into the future. And comparable policies do exist for some of the other places I've mentioned. Daisyville is a local conservation area within the city of Botany Bay, and it's now afforded some protection by a development control plan that covers the scale, the height, the colour, the design of prospective renovation and redevelopment. But what about the identification of other places that might have some planning history component, but presently enjoy little recognition and or protection? Well, this is a task I've set for the last couple of years, and indeed this year, my second year planning students, to think about what sites can they identify in Sydney that might have some planning history significance. And here's a selection of them listed. In this way, they gain, I think, a practical appreciation of the role of planning in shaping the cultural landscape of cities. And some real gems have come out of this student research, like Green Bands Park in Erskineville. This recognises the importance of a specific struggle to retain a former RTA site as open space in a precinct very much starved for parkland. And it was done with the assistance of a latter-day green band put on by the CFMEU. But the name of this park, Green Bands Park, of course acknowledges that broader heritage of the 1970s. The movement led by Jack Mundy, which of course rescued a lot of valuable spaces that might otherwise have gone under the demolition ball, and indeed set in train a movement that led to new environmental planning legislation in New South Wales. Another site that a student discovered last year, which I didn't know about, was the Mill Drive estate at North Rocks, a planned defence housing estate from the 1960s and very much bearing the imprint of the sort of Sydney bushland school of architecture. So there are places out there still to be discovered that might, even just at a local level, have some significance for the history of planning. It's also, however, sobering to think of some of those places and environments which have been compromised or even destroyed by later development. Unsympathetic, not knowing about what the original design intent of a place was intended to be. Sometimes in the distant past. This is St Vincent Place. Made our list of the top 20, but nevertheless was severely harmed when you see that railway being sort of slashed through the whole eastern side of the estate in the 19th century. This place would have made our list if it still existed. It's Geelong in Victoria, which was designed and built in the 1920s as a dormitory town for workers in the adjacent brown coal mine and power station. This was a substantial town. The design and architecture by Alan Lagersh and the resources pumped into this place through the 1950s made it really the most convincing compact garden town in Australia. Unfortunately, it also sat on top of the brown coal deposits. And from the 1970s, it was progressively demolished. Some of the timber cottages were relocated to other parts of the Latrobe Valley. Peter Reid's book, Return to Nothing, The Meaning of Lost Places, poignantly recalls the sort of vain attempts of the Save Your Lawn Committee to prevent this happening. But there was a steamroller happening. It was inevitable that it was going to go. Incredibly, there was no attempt to formally record the physical, the social or the environmental heritage of this place, because all of this happens before the state and indeed before the Commonwealth has passed any heritage legislation. So somewhat perversely, and sadly, what we now find is that a number of the individual houses that were relocated from the town of Geelong in the 1970s only now find themselves being recognised as potentially of heritage significance. Other places are also under threat. Woomera is the incredible shrinking town, as this image conveys. At its peak, it had a population of about 5,000. Now it has a couple of hundred. And I've been involved in a study that's trying to recognise how cultural heritage can, in fact, inform the sustainability of remote places like this. One thing becomes very clear, and that is the need for vigilance to defend the significance and qualities of planned environments like any other type of environment that is of value to the community. There are many publicised fights against planning. From time to time, we also need to fight for planning. I was taken by Malcolm Turnbull's comment last month when, this is a positive comment, when he was asked about concerns regarding the transfer of responsibility of the Centennial Parklands from the to the SCG Trust. And he said, quote, "I don't think this is any time to be complacent. Centennial and more parks have been coveted by governments for the purpose of development forever. We have to defend every single square centimetre of those parks." While Canberra has many outstanding and obvious examples of successful planning from different periods, it also has its share of disasters. As was once said, it's a city where even the mistakes are planned. When the National Capital Authority produced its Griffin Legacy scheme in 2006, I think it was a landmark for the use of history to inform urban design. But subsequently, many of the recommendations that have flowed from that have proven somewhat controversial, seemingly being driven more by market forces alone rather than an informed respect for historic design. And many of those changes and actions have been contested because of the threats to the historic planning qualities which derive from the Griffin and later eras. And the Walter-Burley-Griffin Society has played, I think, a key role in protest, and my colleague James Werrick heroically seems to spend an inordinate amount of his time seeking to remind decision makers about the heritage values that are at risk. Most recently, for example, with this so-called New Acton development, comprising several rather unsympathetically designed high-rise towers, which monster the old 1920s Hotel Acton, a quintessential residential hostel nestled within an attractive landscape setting. And the point here is that the vigilance and resilience of local conservation and environmental groups is essential to keeping watch on any planned environment under threat. Some places get it more consistently right. I think Adelaide certainly has come to grips with its planning heritage. The late George Clark did a strategic plan there in the 1970s, which was just a vital platform for a more heritage-sensitive approach to planning in that city, and I think the national heritage designation of the Plan of Adelaide last year is very much perhaps a culmination of the work that he set in train. Central Melbourne here is also an example of a place that has sought to both conserve and capitalise upon the environmental heritage of being a planned place. Rob Adams, the city's Director of Design, was given a bit of caning in the last Utzon lecture for leaving out people, but his role in marrying Hoddle's 1830s plan and its heritage of parkland into the setting for a true living city, I think has been exemplary. And the work that they did in 1987 in the study entitled Grids and Greenery, the character of inner Melbourne, I think says it all. Sometimes we muck it up and then undo it and get it right. Forest Place in central Perth was created in the 1920s as a new public street by the Commonwealth Government to showcase its major public buildings on the right-hand side there, Commonwealth Bank and General Post Office. In the 1980s, when the planning fashion was all about overhead walkways to create separate pedestrian circulation systems, in their wisdom the council put this overhead walkway first floor level between two flanking buildings right across the square, obstructing the whole kind of vista from the railway station. A couple of years ago, at great expense and involving a very complex set of negotiations with all the stakeholders involved, the council conceded the error of its ways and finally removed that walkway, and so reinstated, I think, the historic access and integrity of Forest Place. My final example tonight of a positive intervention reinforcing historic planning values is the Ceremonial Gateway at Centennial Park. This happens to be the work of our own Dean's design practice, and I'm not trying to ingratiate myself here nakedly into your good books, but here is an excellent illustration of where older traditions have been merged with new design values and opportunities. This project won an Australian Timber Design Award, which is great. That's on the right-hand side, but on the left-hand side you can really see the significance of this project. It crystallises and reinforces a planned greenway connection conceived in the 1910s to link funnel people from Anzac Parade directly into Centennial Park. It's a gesture that makes a great valuation and validation of the public realm, which really is what planning should be all about. So I want to wrap up because I've gone on a bit. This lecture has been about recognising the importance of planned environments in cultural heritage assessments. And I think this is underdone at the present time. So I want to add to the list that I showed you earlier, beyond the Opera House, to think about things like housing estates or civic precincts, or parkways or new towns, and so on. And my educational aim is to bring planning and its landscapes a little bit more obviously, but not uncritically, into both Australian urban history and heritage practice. I'm hoping that the publication of this book, which I don't get any royalties from, will stimulate public interest, not just about sites of national significance, but for many of those other sites that should matter to particular communities. And there's sites with which architects, and landscape architects and surveyors and engineers have all contributed as well. I conclude by returning to Carl Feiss's words from 70 years ago. The study of planned communities and building groups is essential. Australians have to some extent been blind to this positive heritage of planning. Beyond the negative public image so often associated lately with planning, I think there is a positive role in shaping the Australian urban environment over more than 2 centuries, which needs to be acknowledged. And I'll end on that point. Thank you.
As is our custom, we have time for a few questions if there are any involved. I'm not sure if there are microphones here tonight.
Well, did you consider industrial heritage as, and I really mean the planning of industrial heritage, Walsh Bay and some of the, I guess, the fairly massive engineering type developments, but they were planned developments, quite significant developments in the city, various cities.
Yeah. We felt that if we went too far in that direction, we'd start merging into engineering history, and that would sort of dilute our major focus. We certainly did look at the institutional design of particular precincts, campuses, hospitals, industrial zones were part of that. We looked at showgrounds. We looked indeed at sort of large open spaces. But none of them made the top 20. But in the book, they feature indeed the sort of lineage of heritage in relation to industrial estate planning. We trace there into the modern day business park.
I might just take one more.
Yes, Rob, I'd really like to thank you for your presentation and doing that whole traces, as it were, of physical planning, were both heroic and at times tragic. And just briefly on Canberra, I think it's important to note that Canberra is up for National Heritage Assessment in the next year. But I'm interested in the fact that you nominated the Metropolitan Plan. And if we look beyond the physical traces of elements of built plans, to the more abstract processes of urban development that are really the main drivers of planning as an activity. I'm just wondering how you relate it to the other metropolitan structure plans. For example, the Cumberland County Plan or the Sydney Region Outline Plan.
Well, certainly the Y Plan, as was called from the late 1960s in Canberra, was not atypical of many of the metro planning strategies that were being devised elsewhere in Australia at that time, and indeed elsewhere around the world. There was a decisive sea change between an approach to planning which was driven by green belts and satellite towns to a form of planning that was intended to accommodate what was seen as almost endless urban expansion in the future. And so paralleling the planning strategy in Canberra that produced its distinctive footprint is the Sydney Regional Outline Plan of 1968, studies undertaken in Melbourne in the late 1960s, the Perth Plan from 1970, even foreshadowed by the Adelaide Metropolitan Plan in 1962. And indeed picking up a variety of different parallels in plans for Copenhagen and Washington DC and London at the same time. What makes Canberra so special is that because the land was held in national ownership. The planners could sit down and devise a long-term extension scheme that was not going to confront all the problems of private property ownership and property rights that their counterparts in the other cities were going to face. And so, remarkably, this is what happens, and Canberra rolls out as a series of new towns, all of them cradled within hills, framed by open space, linked by parkways, hopefully a mass transit system sometime in the future. All of it a classic sort of textbook example for where metropolitan planning theory was going at that time. And I think it results in a metropolitan form that works. It's way too auto-dependent, but it nevertheless carries the seeds within it of adaptability to a new form of mass transit sometime in the future.
Well, I couldn't think of a better way to end the evening. So thank you, Freestone. We can join